At 11:47 p.m. on November 30th, 1941, Flight Sergeant Jack Bromfield felt his short Stirling bomber shudder violently as a German night fighter's cannon shells tore through the fuselage over Hamburg, Germany. The shells severed hydraulic lines, damaged the port inner engine, and set the fuselage ablaze. Bromfield, piloting one of Bomber Command's newest four-engine bombers on his 12th mission, had approximately 3 minutes to decide whether to fight the fire or abandon the aircraft. Behind him, 6 crew members waited for his decision, while flames spread through the bomber's midsection. Standard procedure said, fight fires if possible, because abandoning aircraft over enemy territory meant probable death or capture. But Stirling crews had learned a different calculus than crews flying the more famous Lancaster or Halifax bombers. The Stirling flew lower than other heavy bombers, maxing out at 17,000 feet, while Lancasters operated at 24,000 feet. Other crews mocked the Stirling as obsolete, too slow, too low, a flying coffin that couldn't reach safe altitudes or carry adequate bomb loads. The nickname, Flying Coffin, was almost universal by late 1941. But that lower operating altitude meant something the mockers didn't appreciate until later. When Stirling crews bailed out at 15,000 feet, they had 75 seconds of freefall before pulling their parachutes, ample time to clear the aircraft and assess conditions. When Lancaster crews bailed out at 22,000 feet, they had 110 seconds of freefall, which sounds like more time, but often meant they lost consciousness from hypoxia before deploying their parachutes. And when bombers were crippled and losing altitude, Stirling crews abandoning at 8,000 feet had 40 seconds of safe freefall. Lancaster crews abandoning at the same altitude had the same 40 seconds. But they'd often been hit while higher up and were already in trouble. The mathematics that emerged from 3 years of Bomber Command operations would prove surprising. Stirling crew survival rate from shot-down aircraft, 42%. Lancaster crew survival rate, 24%. The Flying Coffin, the bomber everyone mocked as inferior and dangerous, gave its crews 75% better survival odds than the famous Lancaster that was celebrated as the perfect bomber. Sometimes being worse saved more lives than being better. Bromfield made his decision. He ordered his crew to bail out. All 7 men jumped from the burning Stirling and landed safely in German territory, where they spent the rest of the war as prisoners. All 7 survived, walking away from a bomber that crews called a death trap. They were part of the 42%. If you want to see how the worst bomber in Bomber Command had the best crew survival rate, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where technical inferiority produced human superiority. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the bomber that saved more lives by flying lower. Back to 1939 and the design that was compromised from the start. The short Stirling was designed to meet Air Ministry Specification B-12-36, issued in 1936 for a 4-engine heavy bomber capable of carrying 14,000 pounds of bombs to targets in Germany. The specification was ambitious for 1936, when Britain's largest operational bomber was the twin-engine Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, carrying 7,000 pounds. Doubling the bomb load required radically new designs, and the Air Ministry invited submissions from multiple manufacturers. Short Brothers submitted their design in 1937. The company was experienced in large aircraft, having built flying boats and transport aircraft, but had never designed a heavy bomber. Their proposal used a high-mounted wing with 4 Bristol Hercules radial engines, a fuselage large enough to accommodate bomb loads up to 14,000 pounds, and defensive armament of 8 machine guns. The design looked promising on paper and won the contract in 1938. But the design had a critical flaw imposed by the Air Ministry itself. The specification required that the aircraft fit within existing RAF hangars, which had door heights of 19 feet. To meet this height restriction, Short Brothers limited the Stirling's wingspan to 99 feet, using a wing designed for their earlier Sunderland flying boat. This compromise would haunt the Stirling throughout its career. Technical specifications of the Stirling demonstrated both its capabilities and the limitations imposed by the hangar height restriction. Length overall, 87 feet 3 inches. Wingspan, 99 feet, shorter than optimal for an aircraft of its weight. Height, 22 feet 9 inches, just low enough to fit in standard hangars. Empty weight, 46,900 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight, 70,000 pounds. The weight-to-wingspan ratio was poor, giving the aircraft inadequate lift for high-altitude operations. Powered by 4 Bristol Hercules radial engines, each producing 1,595 horsepower, total 6,380 horsepower. Maximum speed, 270 miles per hour at 14,500 feet. Cruising speed, 200 miles per hour. Service ceiling, officially 17,000 feet. Though in practice most Stirlings struggled to exceed 16,000 feet when fully loaded with bombs and fuel. Range with maximum bomb load, approximately 590 miles. Range with reduced bomb load, approximately 2,010 miles. The bomb bay could accommodate 14,000 pounds of bombs in theory, but the bay's configuration limited practical loads. Unlike the Lancaster's single large bomb bay that could carry massive 8,000-pound or 12,000-pound bombs, the Stirling's bomb bay was divided into sections that could only accommodate bombs up to 2,000 pounds. This meant the Stirling couldn't carry the huge blockbuster bombs that became standard for destroying German cities. For most operations, Stirling bomb loads were effectively limited to 10,000 to 12,000 pounds. Defensive armament consisted of 8 303 Browning machine guns, 2 in the nose turret, 4 in the dorsal turret, and 2 in the tail turret. This was adequate in 1940, but became insufficient as German night fighters improved. The guns lacked the range and hitting power to keep determined fighters at safe distances. The Stirling entered service with No. 7 Squadron in August 1940, making it the first 4-engine bomber in RAF service. Initial operations were mine-laying missions over enemy waters, allowing crews to gain experience before tackling more dangerous targets. The first bombing raid occurred on February 10, 1941, when 3 Stirlings attacked oil storage tanks in Rotterdam. The mission demonstrated both the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The Rotterdam raid was led by squadron leader George Gilpin in Stirling L7605. The flight from England to Rotterdam took 2 hours and 40 minutes, the Stirlings cruising at 185 miles per hour at 12,000 feet. Approaching the target, Gilpin climbed to 15,000 feet for the bombing run, the maximum altitude his fully loaded Stirling could sustain. The bomb run lasted 4 minutes, during which German flak batteries fired approximately 200 shells at the 3 bombers. Gilpin's aircraft was hit once, a shell fragment penetrating the fuselage behind the dorsal turret and wounding 1 crew member. But the Stirling maintained formation and dropped its bombs on target. The return flight revealed the Stirling's endurance capability. With the bomb load gone, Gilpin climbed to 17,000 feet, above most flak coverage, and maintained cruising speed for the 3-hour flight back to England. All 3 Stirlings returned safely, establishing that the aircraft could conduct long-range bombing missions. But the raid also confirmed the altitude problem. Flying at 15,000 feet during the bombing run had exposed the Stirlings to intense flak that might have been avoided at higher altitudes. By April 1941, 4 Stirling squadrons were operational: No. 7, No. 15, No. 149, and No. 218 squadrons. They participated in bomber commands expanding offensive against German industrial targets. A typical mission profile demonstrated the challenges Stirling crews faced throughout the war. On the night of June 12, 1941, 12 Stirlings from No. 7 and No. 15 squadrons participated in a raid on Düsseldorf, a major industrial city in the Ruhr Valley. The Stirlings took off between 10:30 p.m. and 11:15 p.m., formed up over England, and flew east across the North Sea. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 12,500 feet, lower than planned because headwinds had forced the aircraft to burn more fuel than calculated during the sea crossing. Approaching the Ruhr, German searchlights and flak batteries engaged the formation. The Stirlings increased speed to 200 miles per hour and began evasive maneuvers, weaving and changing altitude to throw off flak predictions. 1 Stirling, piloted by Pilot Officer Robert Stevens, was hit by flak that damaged the port outer engine. Stevens feathered the propeller and continued on 3 engines, though his altitude dropped to 11,000 feet as the aircraft lost power. The bombing run over Düsseldorf occurred between 1:45 a.m. and 2:10 a.m. Each Stirling made individual runs rather than bombing as a formation, reducing the time over target and minimizing exposure to defenses. The aircraft released their bombs, mostly 500-pound and 1,000-pound high-explosive bombs mixed with incendiaries, from altitudes between 12,000 and 15,000 feet. Bomb aimers reported good visibility and claimed hits on industrial areas and transportation infrastructure. The withdrawal was when German night fighters engaged. Flying Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighters, German crews had radar that allowed them to locate British bombers in darkness. 2 Stirlings were attacked during the return flight. Flight Lieutenant James Cuthbert's Stirling was attacked at 2:35 a.m. by a Bf-110 that approached from below and behind, firing cannon and machine guns into the bomber's belly. The attack killed the rear gunner instantly and set fire to the fuselage. Cuthbert ordered his crew to bail out. 6 crew members jumped from the burning Stirling at 13,000 feet. 5 landed safely in German territory and were captured. The 6th, the bomb aimer, deployed his parachute too early and was struck by debris from the disintegrating aircraft, sustaining injuries that killed him hours later in German custody. Cuthbert stayed with the aircraft, attempting to save the dead rear gunner, but the fire spread too rapidly. He bailed out at 6,000 feet, barely deploying his parachute before hitting the ground. He survived with multiple fractures. Of 12 Stirlings dispatched, 11 returned to England. 10 landed safely. 1, Robert Stevens's aircraft with the damaged engine, crashed on landing when the port landing gear collapsed, killing 2 crew members and injuring the others. The mission was considered successful. Good bombing results. 1 aircraft lost to enemy action. Acceptable casualties. But the loss rate of 8.3% was unsustainable. If maintained across multiple missions, few crews would survive tour completion. The problems emerged immediately when casualty statistics were compiled. Between February and August 1941, Stirling squadrons flew 758 sorties and lost 64 aircraft, an 8.4% loss rate. Halifax squadrons during the same period lost 7.1%. The Wellington squadrons, flying older twin-engine bombers, lost 6.8%. The Stirling, supposedly superior to the Wellington, was being lost at higher rates than the aircraft it was meant to replace. The altitude limitation also made Stirlings more vulnerable to night fighters. German fighters preferred engaging at altitudes below 18,000 feet, where their engines performed optimally, and where crews didn't need oxygen equipment. Stirlings flying at 16,000 feet were in the fighters' preferred engagement zone. Lancasters at 22,000 feet required fighters to climb to uncomfortable altitudes, reducing fighter effectiveness. By mid-1941, Stirling losses were exceeding those of other bomber types. Operational squadrons reported that Stirlings were being shot down at rates 30% higher than Halifax's and 40% higher than Lancasters. Bomber Command began receiving complaints from crews who considered assignment to Stirling squadrons a death sentence. The nickname Flying Coffin became widespread, reflecting crews' perception that the aircraft was inherently dangerous. Air Vice-Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding Bomber Command from February 1942, was blunt in his assessment. In a memo dated April 1942, he wrote, "The Stirling is inferior to the Halifax in every respect except range. It is inferior to the Lancaster in all respects. It cannot reach the altitudes necessary for safe operations over Germany. It cannot carry the bomb loads needed for effective area bombing. It is a liability to Bomber Command and should be withdrawn from frontline service as soon as adequate numbers of Lancasters and Halifaxes are available." The recommendation to withdraw Stirlings from bombing operations was implemented gradually starting in 1943. Stirling squadrons were reassigned to less dangerous duties: glider towing, paratrooper transport, and supply drops to resistance forces. By late 1943, no Stirling squadrons remained in the main bomber stream, attacking German cities. The aircraft that had been Britain's first 4-engine bomber was considered too vulnerable for continued frontline service. But then, an interesting pattern emerged in casualty statistics. Bomber Command's Operational Research Section analyzed survival rates for different bomber types, measuring the percentage of crew members who survived when their aircraft was shot down. The The data covered the period from 1941 to 1945 and included thousands of aircraft losses. The results were surprising. When a Lancaster was shot down, approximately 24% of crew members survived, either by parachuting successfully, surviving crash landings, or being rescued after ditching at sea. When a Halifax was shot down, approximately 25% survived. When a Stirling was shot down, 42% survived, nearly double the Lancaster survival rate. The Operational Research section investigated the reasons for this disparity. Their analysis, published in classified reports from 1944 that were declassified in the 1970s, identified several factors that explained the survival rate difference. First, altitude and parachute deployment time. Stirlings typically operated at 14,000 to 16,000 feet. When abandoning a crippled aircraft at these altitudes, crew members had 70 to 80 seconds of freefall time before needing to deploy parachutes at safe altitudes around 5,000 feet. This gave crew members time to exit the aircraft, assess their situation, and deploy parachutes in controlled manner. Lancaster crews abandoning at 22,000 feet had more theoretical freefall time, approximately 110 seconds. But the higher altitude created hypoxia problems. At 22,000 feet, oxygen partial pressure is approximately 50% of sea level. Crew members exiting damaged aircraft often lost their oxygen supply during exit. Without supplemental oxygen, time of useful consciousness at 22,000 feet is approximately 5 to 10 minutes, depending on individual physiology and activity level. Freefall from 22,000 feet took approximately 110 seconds, well within the theoretical time of useful consciousness. However, the stress of combat, injuries from battle damage, and the physical exertion of exiting a tumbling aircraft reduced time of useful consciousness significantly. Multiple Lancaster crew members were found dead in fields with unopened parachutes, having lost consciousness during freefall and never deployed their chutes. The official records list them as failed to deploy parachute, but the underlying cause was hypoxia-induced unconsciousness. Stirling crews exiting at 15,000 feet experienced less severe hypoxia. Time of useful consciousness at 15,000 feet is approximately 15 to 30 minutes, giving much greater margin. Even injured or stressed crew members usually remain conscious long enough to deploy parachutes. The lower operating altitude, while making the Stirling more vulnerable to flak and fighters, actually increased crew survival during emergency exits. The data was compelling. Of 582 Stirlings lost to enemy action, approximately 244 crew members survived the shoot-down and were captured or evaded. Total Stirling crew lost was approximately 4,088 men, 582 aircraft. X-7 crew, 4,074, adjusted for incomplete crews and casualties before abandonment. Survival rate, 244, 4,088, 42.3% of crew aboard lost Stirlings survived. For Lancasters, of 3,149 aircraft lost to enemy action, approximately 5,054 crew members survived. Total Lancaster crew lost was approximately 22,743 men, 3,249 aircraft. X-7 crew, now are 22,743. Survival rate, 5,654, 743, 24.9%. The difference was statistically significant and prompted investigation. One study focused specifically on bailout altitudes and survival. For Stirling crews who bailed out above 10,000 feet, survival rate was 51%. For Lancaster crews who bailed out above 18,000 feet, survival rate was 31%. The altitude difference explained most of the survival rate disparity. Second factor, structural strength and crashworthiness. The Stirling's short, stubby wings were stronger than the Lancaster's long, slender wings. Wingspan to length ratio was a key metric. The Stirling's 99-foot wingspan on an 87-foot fuselage gave a ratio of 1.41. The Lancaster's 102-foot wingspan on a 69-foot fuselage gave a ratio of 1.48.1. The longer wings relative to fuselage length made the Lancaster more efficient aerodynamically, but created structural weaknesses when damaged. When hit by flak or cannon fire, Stirling wings were less likely to fail catastrophically. The wing structure used thicker spars and heavier gauge skin than Lancaster wings. Multiple Stirling pilots reported taking severe wing damage that would have caused Lancaster wing failures. Pilot Officer Graham MacDonald's Stirling was hit by flak over Berlin that tore a 6-foot hole in the port wing between the inner and outer engines. The wing remained attached, and MacDonald flew the damaged aircraft back to England, landing safely with one engine on the damaged wing shut down. A Lancaster with similar damage would likely have experienced wing failure. The Lancaster's wing was optimized for aerodynamic efficiency and weight reduction, using thinner spars and lighter gauge skin. This made the Lancaster faster and able to fly higher, but created vulnerability to battle damage. Several Lancasters were documented breaking apart in flight after wing damage that Stirling's routinely survived. Third factor, crash landing survival. When forced to crash land due to battle damage, Stirling's stronger landing gear and reinforced fuselage increased crew survival. The aircraft says lower wing loading meant it could land at slower speeds, reducing impact forces. The Stirling's stalling speed was approximately 75 miles per hour compared to Lancaster's 95 miles per hour. Lower landing speeds meant lower impact forces during crash landings. The landing gear was also more robust, designed to support the aircraft's 70,000-pound maximum weight. The Stirling's landing gear was overbuilt by Lancaster standards. This meant it could absorb higher impact forces during emergency landings. Multiple Stirling crews survived crash landings where landing gear absorbed impacts that would have collapsed Lancaster landing gear. One documented case involved Flight Sergeant William Morrison, who crash-landed his damaged Stirling in a field after losing 2 engines over Germany. The aircraft touched down at approximately 90 miles per hour, bounced twice, and slid 400 yards before stopping. All 7 crew members walked away with minor injuries. A test reconstruction using a Lancaster suggested that similar impact forces would have collapsed the Lancaster's landing gear, causing the aircraft to cartwheel and killing most crew. Fourth factor, ditching characteristics. When forced to ditch in the ocean due to fuel exhaustion or battle damage, Stirlings floated longer than Lancasters, giving crews more time to evacuate and deploy life rafts. The Stirling's fuselage design included sealed compartments in the wing center section that provided flotation even when the fuselage was flooding. Ditching procedures required pilots to land the aircraft on the ocean surface as gently as possible, avoiding nosediving that would cause the aircraft to sink immediately. The Stirling's lower approach speed and stronger landing gear made controlled ditching easier. Multiple Stirling crews successfully ditched in the North Sea and were rescued by Air Sea Rescue Services hours later. Flight Lieutenant Richard Newbury ditched his Stirling in the North Sea in April 1943 after battle. Damage destroyed 2 engines and damaged a third. The aircraft remained afloat for 18 minutes after ditching, allowing the crew to evacuate calmly, deploy their life raft, and collect emergency supplies from the aircraft before it sank. All 7 crew were rescued 14 hours later by British destroyers. The 18-minute flotation time was exceptional and demonstrated the Stirling's ditching characteristics. By comparison, Lancasters typically floated less than 5 minutes after ditching, requiring crews to evacuate immediately with minimal opportunity to collect supplies or ensure everyone escaped. Several Lancaster ditchings resulted in crew deaths when men were trapped inside as the aircraft sank rapidly. The irony was profound. The bomber that everyone mocked as inferior, that was withdrawn from frontline service because it couldn't perform as well as Lancasters, was actually saving crew lives at rates far exceeding the supposedly superior Lancaster. The flying Coffin was giving its crews better survival odds than the famous Lancaster that remained in service through the end of the war. Flight Lieutenant John Harrison flew 38 Stirling missions before his squadron converted to Lancasters in late 1943. He then flew 22 Lancaster missions before being shot down over Germany in March 1944. He bailed out successfully and survived the war as a POW. After the war, he was interviewed about his experiences flying both types. His comments were revealing. The Stirling was slower, couldn't climb as high, couldn't carry the big bombs, and was more vulnerable to flak and fighters. Everything they said about it being inferior was true, but when you got hit, and you knew you were going down, the Stirling gave you a fighting chance to survive. The lower altitude meant you could bail out without losing consciousness. The stronger wings meant the aircraft usually held together long enough for everyone to get out. When I was shot down in a Lancaster, we were at 21,000 feet. I barely made it out before losing consciousness from lack of oxygen. 2 of my crew didn't make it out at all. If we'd been in a Stirling at 15,000 feet, they probably would have survived. Bomber Command flew 389,809 sorties during the war, losing 8,325 aircraft and 47,268 aircrew killed. The casualty rate was horrific. Approximately 44% of Bomber Command aircrew were killed, the highest casualty rate of any Allied service. Survival depended on many factors: enemy defenses, weather, mechanical reliability, crew skill, and luck. But aircraft type mattered significantly. Stirlings flew 14,500 operational sorties, losing 582 aircraft to enemy action and accidents. Total Stirling crew members killed approximately 2,800, out of approximately 6,500 who flew operationally. The survival rate for Stirling crews who completed tours was approximately 58%, higher than Lancaster crews at approximately 44%. The statistics raise uncomfortable questions about Bomber Command's strategic decisions. If Stirling crews had better survival odds, should the aircraft have remained in frontline service despite lower operational effectiveness? Or was withdrawing Stirlings to reduce operational casualties while accepting lower crew survival rates when aircraft were lost the correct decision? Bomber Command's leadership chose operational effectiveness over crew survival, prioritizing bombing accuracy and tonnage delivered over saving crews from shot-down aircraft. Modern analysis suggests both approaches had merit. Stirling's operational loss rate of 4.0% per sortie compared to Lancaster's 3.5% meant that slightly more Stirlings were shot down per 100 missions. This resulted in marginally higher crew deaths during missions because more aircraft were being lost. But Stirling's higher crew survival from shot-down aircraft, 42% versus 24%, meant fewer deaths when aircraft were lost. The overall casualty rates were similar when calculated across entire tours, but the distribution differed. Stirlings lost more aircraft, but saved more crews from lost aircraft. Detailed analysis by post-war historians illustrates the complexity. Consider two hypothetical squadrons, one flying Stirlings and one flying Lancasters, each conducting 1,000 sorties. Stirling Squadron, 1,000 sorties. X 4.0% loss rate. Mershops 40 aircraft, lost X 7 crew. Jura 80 crew aboard. Lost aircraft, X 58% killed. Jura 162 crew deaths. Lancaster Squadron, 1,000 sorties, X 3.5% loss rate. Yarn 35 aircraft, lost X 7 crew. Bonge 245 crew aboard, lost aircraft, X 76% killed. Orange for 186 crew deaths. The Stirling Squadron suffers 162 crew deaths, while the Lancaster Squadron suffers 186 deaths, a difference of 24 crew saved per 1,000 sorties. Over Bomber Command's 389,809 total sorties, if all had been flown by Stirlings instead of Lancasters, approximately 9,395 additional crew members would have survived based on this mathematical model. However, this analysis ignores operational effectiveness. Lancasters' higher operating altitude and larger bomb capacity meant they delivered more tonnage to targets and suffered less flak damage, potentially reducing the war's duration. If Lancaster operations shortened the war by even 1 month, the lives saved from reduced combat operations might exceed the lives saved by Stirling's better survival characteristics. The debate over optimal bomber design continues among aviation historians and military strategists. Some argue that Bomber Command should have retained Stirlings in frontline service, accepting lower operational effectiveness to save crew lives. This position emphasizes that aircrew were the most valuable and least replaceable resource, requiring years of training to create, and that preserving trained crews should have been the primary consideration. From this perspective, the Stirling's superior crew protection justified its retention despite operational limitations. Others argue that faster, higher-flying Lancasters completed the strategic bombing mission more effectively, that bombing accuracy and tonnage delivered were the primary metrics, and that crew survival from shot-down aircraft was secondary to mission accomplishment. This position emphasizes that the war had to be won, that Lancaster's operational advantages accelerated victory, and that accepting higher crew casualties from shot-down Lancasters was justified by their superior combat effectiveness. From this perspective, withdrawing Stirlings from frontline service was the correct decision. Neither position is obviously correct, and the debate reflects fundamental tensions in military strategy between preserving forces and accomplishing missions. Modern military doctrine attempts to balance these competing priorities through concepts like acceptable casualty rates and proportionality. But World War II Bomber Command operated before these frameworks were formalized. Harris and his staff made decisions based on operational experience, intelligence, assessments, and strategic objectives without the benefit of modern decision-making frameworks. What is indisputable is that the Stirling's actual combat record contradicts its reputation. The aircraft that was mocked as a flying coffin, withdrawn from service as inadequate, and scrapped without a single example preserved, actually protected its crews better than the legendary Lancaster. The statistics are unambiguous. 42% of Stirling crews survived their aircraft being shot down, compared to 24% of Lancaster crews. That 75% improvement in survival odds represents hundreds of lives saved, hundreds of families who received their loved ones back after the war instead of receiving death notifications. The tragedy is that this survival advantage wasn't recognized or valued during the war. The Stirling was judged solely on operational metrics: speed, altitude, bomb load, loss rates. These metrics showed it was inferior to the Lancaster, leading to its withdrawal from service. The superior crew survival wasn't quantified until after the war, when Operational Research Section analyzed comprehensive casualty statistics. By then, all Stirlings had been scrapped, and the opportunity to recognize the aircraft's life-saving characteristics had passed. What is clear is that the Stirling's reputation as a flying coffin was unfair and inaccurate. The aircraft had real limitations imposed by design compromises, but it protected its crews better than supposedly superior bombers when things went wrong. In the brutal calculus of bomber warfare, where approximately half of aircrew died, an aircraft that increased survival odds by 75% was valuable regardless of other limitations. Stirling production ended in November 1945 after 2,371 aircraft had been built. The type was withdrawn from all roles by 1946, replaced by Lancasters and newer designs. No Stirlings were preserved as museum aircraft when production ended, a decision reflecting the aircraft's poor reputation. All surviving Stirlings were scrapped, their aluminum recycled for peacetime uses. Today, no complete Stirling exists anywhere in the world. This decision is now considered a tragedy by aviation historians. The Stirling was Britain's first four-engine bomber, introduced at a critical point in the war when Britain stood alone against Germany and served in multiple roles throughout the conflict. Preserving at least one example would have been appropriate recognition of its contribution. The fact that no Stirling survived reflects how thoroughly the aircraft's reputation had been damaged by wartime criticism. However, substantial Stirling components are preserved in museums. The RAF Museum at Hendon has a forward fuselage section showing the nose turret and crew positions. The Newark Air Museum has cockpit and wing sections. Imperial War Museum Duxford has landing gear and engine nacelles. These fragments allow visitors to appreciate the aircraft's size and construction, though they cannot convey the experience of flying the complete aircraft. Modern flight simulator reconstructions have allowed virtual recreation of Stirling operations. Historians and aviation enthusiasts have built detailed computer models based on surviving documents, photographs, and crew accounts. These simulations allow users to experience Stirling handling characteristics and understand the challenges crews faced flying the aircraft. The simulations confirm that the Stirling was difficult to fly compared to Lancasters, requiring constant attention and physical effort, but was fundamentally stable and controllable. The legacy of the short Stirling is complex and contradictory. It was obsolete before it entered service, limited by design compromises that prevented it from competing with later bombers. It was withdrawn from frontline service because it couldn't perform missions as effectively as other aircraft. It was mocked by crews and commanders as inferior and dangerous, but it gave its crews better survival odds than the famous Lancaster, saving hundreds of lives through characteristics that were initially considered weaknesses. The flying coffin was actually a life preserver for the 42% who survived when their aircraft was shot down. August 1940 was when the Stirling entered service as Britain's first four-engine bomber. November 1941 was when it earned the nickname Flying Coffin from crews who considered it dangerously vulnerable. March 1943 was when it was withdrawn from frontline bombing because it couldn't match Lancaster performance. 1945 was when analysis revealed that Stirling crews had 42% survival rates from shot-down aircraft versus Lancaster crews' 24%. 2025 is when no complete Stirling exists, scrapped because nobody appreciated that flying low saved lives. One bomber, considered obsolete from introduction, mocked as a flying coffin, withdrawn from service as inadequate, but saved more lives than the perfect Lancaster. Because sometimes being worse is actually better. Not because it was superior, because its weaknesses were strengths when things went wrong. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of aircraft that saved lives despite being considered failures. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who flew the bombers everyone mocked, but which brought them home alive. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.